At the end of the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, most of whom had served in the Waffen-SS, could not find their place in the newly emerged post-1945 world order. These men, volunteers and conscripts, came from across Europe with a diverse range of motivations, ranging from anti-communist zealotry to nationalist ambitions. They served in the Nazi armies in divisions that represented immense patriotism and often cruelty. However, as the Third Reich collapsed, the idea of having a future in Hitler's Europe also faded away for stranded Waffen soldiers. With the war's end, these foreign Waffen-SS soldiers found themselves in an uncertain and unforgiving world. Some faced capture and harsh imprisonment, others were rejected or shunned by their own countries and branded as traitors and war criminals. A few managed to vanish into new lives far from the ruins of Europe, but what became of them, and how did the world reckon with their role in history? Could they ever return home, or were they condemned to remain outcasts forever? Today, followers, we will see the tragic final days of Waffen-SS soldiers and will find out hidden realities about their post-war ill-fated lives. The final days, the end of war and surrender of Waffen-SS forces. Towards the end of the Second World War, when Nazi Germany was crumbling, so was the Waffen-SS. There were tens of thousands of Waffen-SS units in the shape of foreign and German units across Europe, and they were operating at all fronts, from the eastern to the western. When they surrendered, a confusing and chaotic situation made the warfare reality a messy part for the Waffen-SS foreign soldiers. To be on the side of the losers, though they were volunteers drawn by anti-communist sentiments, many had no way of moving forward as the Allies tightened their noose. The phenomenon of mass surrenders took place as quickly between April and May of 1945. Because the Waffen-SS divisions were used to the high-powered fighting and no-nonsense attitude, they were immediately brought face-to-face with a new and bitter fact when the Wehrmacht of Germany had more or less vanished. And it is here that whole SS divisions streamed out as isolated and surrounded forces surrendered to the Soviets, Americans, and British. For instance, the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland in northern Germany yielded to the British, and the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, which consisted mainly of Scandinavian volunteers, surrendered to the American forces in Austria. The surrender conditions varied in terms of nationality and the battle record of the unit involved. The German SS soldiers were mainly viewed with mistrust or contempt. They could receive an immediate punishment, which in many cases included summary executions, especially by the Soviet forces who always remembered their sufferings at the hands of SS soldiers. Whereas Frenchmen, Dutchmen, or Danes serving in Waffen-SS were often treated more tolerantly, especially by the Western Allies, who considered them more as misguided enlistees rather than fanatical Nazis. It was not always possible to guess when these distinctions were to be applied, and they did depend on the nationality of the force that was capturing the enemy and the previous performance of the surrendering formations. Because of the large numbers of prisoners, the Allied forces faced immense levels of difficulties in dealing with Waffen-SS soldiers due to logistical issues. American and British forces established several broad POW camps, in which the living conditions were abysmal but at least unchanging. However, those that the Soviets captured had to face worse conditions. Any member of the Waffen-SS was likely to be deported immediately to Siberian prisoners' forced labor camps, also known as concentration camps. During the surrender, the Allies undertook some inquiry to detect those involved in war crimes before arresting the officials believed to be involved in extreme brutality, the SS in particular. War crimes and consequences, trials and sentencing of Waffen-SS leaders and soldiers. After large-scale surrenders of Waffen soldiers, the trials and sentencing of Waffen-SS leaders and soldiers became a central topic in victor's justice. The Allies wanted to prosecute the war crimes perpetrated by the Waffen-SS and primarily focused on participating officers who supervised the genocides. During the Nuremberg trials, various high-profile officers of the Waffen-SS were prosecuted and thousands of the Waffen-SS subordinates became POWs, and their fate remained uncertain. Treatments that foreign SS soldiers received in POW camps depended on the captors. Allied forces camps were most often overcrowded, with sometimes relatively disciplined environments for the prisoners and low rations of food and medical resources. The situation of the camps varied in American and British camps. Ex-SS guards were kept separate from ex-Wehrmacht soldiers to prevent indoctrination. Foreign volunteers who signed up for the SS because of anti-communist ideology and not for Hitler were treated somewhat better, but were considered with suspicion and stigmatized. Many of these prisoners had to withstand a torturous process of questioning as the Allied forces tried to determine the level of commitment each soldier displayed in committing a war crime. The situation in Soviet POW camps looked drastically different. Because of the enormous losses that the war had taken on the Soviet Union, the Red Army had particular animosity towards all members of Waffen-SS. As far as holders of uniforms and other SS soldiers, including foreign ones, were concerned, Soviet camps were rather cruel. These prisoners worked under unbearable circumstances such as congested prisons, scarce food, compulsory work, and harsh winters. Some of the prisoners were sent to labor camps throughout Siberia and other areas, where they had to raise their food and died from hunger, cold, or exhaustion. The Soviet authorities placed Waffen-SS members in the same category of war criminals and subjected them to years of hard work without any trials. While for many Waffen-SS members, captivity lasted 1 or several months, those who fell into the hands of the Soviets often suffered imprisonment for years, and some did not get free till the middle 50s. These were men with health issues. Many of them were physically starved, sick, and psychologically scarred by the events of warfare for the rest of their lives. As the West started to build back their homelands, POWs were returned slowly, but the Soviets continued to use POWs for labor and negotiating power. Repatriation or rejection, the complex journey of returning home after the war. The way home for Waffen-SS foreign fighters after World War II was quite vague and marked by penalties, non-acceptance, and stigmatization. When the Allied forces liberated POW camps, an issue concerning the fate of the citizens who were in Hitler's SS raised controversy in many European nations. Over and over again, they faced the dilemma of repatriation, on the one hand, and the highly charged social and political consequences of dealing with those who appeared to have collaborated with the Nazi regime on the other. France and Norway dismissed former SS men, while the Netherlands banned them from occupations and offices. In France, the government did not allow many of its citizens who had served in German forces to rejoin the French society and declared them traitors. Some of the French volunteers, like the Charlemagne division that fought desperately for Nazi Germany, were put in prison once they managed to return to France. Norway did the same thing, where soldiers who joined the SS got long prison sentences, lost citizenship, and could not reintegrate back into society. Former SS members in Denmark were also punished severely. Many of them were put behind bars and publicly denounced. Some countries, though, were more complex due to diplomatic and political pressures and thus responded differently. The Baltic states, such as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, had a different attitude to the foreign members of Waffen-SS. The majority of the Baltic soldiers joined the SS as a way to fight against the Soviet Union. As the Cold War progressed, the Western countries realized that such soldiers were anti-Soviet rather than pro-Nazi. Still, these veterans received no governmental support or acknowledgement, and when they returned home, they encountered hatred and suspicion. In the societies, independently of the outcome of the war, the returning SS soldiers were quickly rejected and mistrusted throughout Europe. These people had no families, and the ones they had rejected or avoided them as traitors or war criminals. Sometimes, they were unable to get work, lost their rights, and suffered from spurning, where they were denied membership in veterans' organizations, which maintained that such persons were not genuine soldiers. The bitterness for those ex-soldiers who had joined the Waffen-SS due to their anti-communist stance was incomprehensible. They returned to societies that saw their service as an ideological betrayal rather than a multifaceted political stand. In the political aspect, their appearance symbolized how Europe proved after the war and their antagonistic views. In Western European states, governments wanted to have nothing to do with Nazi Germany, while in Eastern Europe, former SS men who had fought the Soviets were now being persecuted under new Soviet-style regimes. Therefore, the acceptance or repatriation of foreign Waffen-SS soldiers closely depended upon Europe's ability to come to terms with the wartime divisions. where many of these soldiers found themselves burdened with a crippled, stigmatized existence in the New World. For those men, life after the war was a battle with the legal system and, more importantly, rejection of society. With their rights taken away and often living in poverty, many never got to be a part of history again. They were never given a second chance in societies that continued to label them as both betrayers and pariahs. The prosecution and punishment of foreign Waffen-SS men provided a timely lesson of the fact that despite the end of the war, most veterans could not efface their past and disassociate themselves from one of the most brutal military formations in history. The Waffen-SS soldiers and limited social acceptance, hardships and prosecutions. The foreign Waffen-SS veterans who came back to their homeland were met with quite a harsh and sometimes even unmanageable welcome. After the war, many states had problems with the demobilization of those who fought for Germany, especially those who served in one of the most criminal formations, Waffen-SS. For these veterans, it meant coming home to a life of social prejudice, criminal prosecution, and the horror of paying for their membership in the Nazi Party. In the Nuremberg trials, the whole Waffen-SS was tried and condemned as a criminal organization. This endowment was a death knell for its members. Top officials were either killed or given lifetime imprisonment, and ordinary soldiers were punished based on their misconduct during the genocide. Most were later detained in Allied prisoner-of-war camps, and they worked as enslaved people constructing camps for the forced repatriation industry. As with the Soviets, which conquered most of Eastern Europe during the war, the end was often inhuman for the Waffen-SS soldiers. Many thousands were deported to the concentration camps known as Gulags, where they succumbed to death from hunger, scurvy and dysentery, or perished from overwork and beatings. In France, Belgium and the Netherlands, the liberation and partisan groups and local residents witnessed justice by any means regardless of the rule of law. Lynchings, mass executions and violent punishments of former SS members and often their families were recorded. In consolidated Czechoslovakia, after the conclusion of the war, the captured personnel of the Waffen-SS were subjected to mass shootings. Whole sections of the population were executed. This was in fulfillment of the vengeful attitude of countries that for years were ruled by Nazis. These acts were not revenge, but a bitter declaration of people's collective memory of historical injustices and a call for retribution. In Germany, the Waffen-SS soldiers found a society that was keen to leave its Nazi images behind. Some of the people hid their services in order not to be prosecuted and to escape social isolation. Only a handful of people went in search of togetherness and sought it in veterans' organizations, but that too was viewed with disdain. Job prospects remained limited, and reintegration into society was nearly impossible. For the men of the Waffen-SS, war's end was liberation in name only, liberation from society, from their homelands, and at times from themselves. These are histories of the affected, which paint the extent of the trauma that the world found itself in after World War I, when justice metamorphosed into revenge, and the two parties suffered the weight of history's condemnation. Seeking refuge and escape, Waffen-SS veterans in South America and beyond. After the brutal end of the Second World War, numerous foreign Waffen-SS veterans, especially those of East European origin, which Juan Perón was leading at that time, was especially famous for giving asylum to former Nazis, including officers, as well as SS members. Some of these people gravitated to Perón's government, which saw them as allies against communism and started to take root in Europe and Latin America. A framework of Nazi expatriates and like-minded people helped Waffen-SS veterans who were escaping in some ways. These secret organizations, which were often established by ex-SS men, assisted in arranging escape routes and forged documents alongside responsibilities for providing financial aid. One of them was the so-called Ratlines, a network for escape mainly run by Catholic clergy, by which Nazis fled to South America and elsewhere. The Vatican and some individuals, specifically within the Church, were also involved in this programming and assisted numerous criminals in escaping punishment. Wherever they went, Waffen-SS veterans had problems restarting their lives. Even though they managed to avoid prosecution then, they still felt the burden of the sins they committed. Most sought change and adopted new forms of identity for themselves by an endeavor to build new enterprises. Some achieved careers in agricultural or construction sectors or joined Latin America's unstable political wars as soldiers. Still, that did not mean the memory of their evil actions faded into oblivion. Some had relatively quiet tenures in their new locales, though many feel the threat of exposure at any given moment, significantly as war crime probes ramped up during the 1950s and 1960s. The long shadows, Cold War manipulation and exploitation of Waffen-SS veterans. After World War II, the Cold War drastically changed the destiny of foreign Waffen-SS members. In the immediate post-war years, former SS soldiers were seen as criminals. But during the Cold War, such service was reinterpreted in light of ideological and geopolitical schemata. Hence, some of these veterans were not only pardoned, but were even wooed by Western intelligence agencies as a marked change in their treatment. The majority of the SS fighters who actively participated in the war were prosecuted in the years immediately following the war. But with the advent of the Cold War, Western powers, especially the US and Great Britain, looked the other way or even pardoned their earlier activities for needed expertise in dealing with the Soviet Union threat. With Europe and the world splitting into blocs, the ex-SS soldiers were given worth due to their experiences, such as war against the Soviet Union, and their profound understanding of communism. The most prominent of such changes was the inclusion of former SS officers in the Western secret services, such as the CIA and British MI6. The story of Otto Skorzeny was highly regarded as a high-ranked SS officer who was close to Hitler and commanded some incredible operations during the war. The Allies arrested Skorzeny at the end of the Second World War, but soon became an asset to the United States of America. His experience of the warfare strategies against the Soviet threat and having contacts in former Nazi organizations meant that he was perfect for Cold War espionage work. Skorzeny was not alone. Many of the former SS soldiers were secretly recruited into the intelligence agencies to fight the spread of communism. Not only intelligence positions, but substantial numbers of former SS members were able to secure positions within the newly formed military structure of West Germany. The Federal Republic of Germany, which was aspiring to establish a solid military force only with the Soviets' growing muscle, wanted to bring back the former Nazis into the military fold, provided they had no Nazi principles in them. These pardons were extended to cooperation with the Western Allies in intelligence and defense. Veterans associations and the controversial historical legacy of foreign Waffen-SS veterans. The home countries of foreign Waffen-SS veterans greeted these men as hostile or suspicious. Most got socially isolated. They faced legal consequences or were accused of high treason. To remedy such isolation and support each other, the former Waffen-SS soldiers, especially from the occupied countries such as the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and Latvia, formed veteran associations. These organizations offered not only emotional and logistic support to their members, but also tried to restore dignity to the persons who had been in the Waffen-SS. However, controversies were sparked by the activities of these associations, which were criticized for advancing the falsification of history and revisionism. One of the primary intents of these associations was to form a community of former members of the Waffen-SS and help them legally and financially. Such groups tend to argue that members of their formations wore the uniform and fought as anti-communist soldiers rather than Nazis. They claimed that because they were anti-communist fighters, these men were not strictly Nazis, but rather men of convenience, drawn into the fight against communism because communism was perceived as another brand of oppression. The social organizations that spoke for foreign SS veterans usually portrayed their members as regular soldiers, typical fighters of Waffen-SS, and ignored or denied involvement in the crimes of the Nazi regime. For instance, Latvian Legionnaires Association provided a patriotic view of their service, that they were fighting not for Nazi Germany and its genocidal policies, but to liberate Latvia from the Soviet occupation. Through such a narrative, these associations aimed at building a new positive image of themselves as victims of a politically charged period, rather than evildoers influenced by Nazi ideology. Such rebranding met with opposition from historians, governments, and other NGOs that see these affiliations as trying to rewrite the historical image of the Waffen-SS as an actor in the Holocaust and other atrocities. Such veterans' associations were accused of distorting history, in which Waffen-SS played roles in brutality and the killings of Jews and non-Jewish civilians. These associations had been frequently criticized for attempts to hide the Waffen-SS's criminal past, presenting members of the associations as defenders of their lands rather than as collaborators of the genocide regime. Many critics even suspected that some of these associations had definite agenda and were involved in whitewashing the historical facts about the Waffen-SS for nationalist or neo-Nazi purposes and to justify the actions of the organizations to which these people in spirit obeyed. These associations penetrated the public domain, as most of them were comprised of veterans and people with experience in service. In some countries, veterans' organizations stood triumphant in compelling why the community should recognize them in ownership, parading, memorial, and other ceremonial events. These occasions tended to portray the former Waffen-SS soldiers as fallen heroes rather than criminals, and this received criticism from the bodies of the Holocaust and from the victims as well. For instance, every year in Latvia, commemorations of the Latvian Legion, an SS unit that fought on the Eastern Front, faced heavy criticisms both nationally and internationally, since critics argued that these commemorations were meant to whitewash the Legion's collaboration with Nazi Germany and perpetrated a fake historical narrative. Waffen-SS warriors, while admired by some former Eastern Bloc states as anti-Soviet freedom fighters, were viewed by the majority of modern European and Middle Eastern and North African states, as well as by Jewish groups, as collaborators deserving punishment and not rehabilitation. The drama of these two interpretations was emblematic of a more significant conflict about how best to understand and commemorate both the Second World War's multifaceted and traumatic aspects. Organizations representing former soldiers had been critical in constructing this story through public commemorations, periodicals, and lobbying for the restoration of Waffen-SS veterans' accounts as a part of the history of the 20th century. The most contradictory activities of some veteran associations caused increased public discussions, especially when ex-Waffen soldiers were allowed to attend national celebrations or were given state payments. Sometimes they were commemorated as anti-Soviet heroes who fought for the liberation of their motherland, which was typical for some areas of the Baltic states, while in some countries there was no problem in recognizing the Waffen-SS veterans in any way due to their war participation against communism. The same thing raised ethical issues in many European countries because Waffen-SS committed war crimes. This divide highlighted a fundamental challenge in post-war Europe: overcoming narratives of wartime cooperation with national histories of anti-fascism and more global responsibilities to human rights and Holocaust memory. The lasting impact. Remembering the legacy and controversy of foreign Waffen-SS today, the existence of foreign Waffen-SS fighters is one of the most problematic and debated post-war phenomena of the Second World War. These foreign SS units that were formed from the volunteers and conscripts from the occupied or the Allied countries to the Axis powers had joined with Nazi Germany for myriad reasons, such as extreme hatred for the communists, affinity to the cultural and political ideology of the Nazi regime, or to have some opportunities. Their positions in history to this very day remain a contentious issue, with portrayals ranging from representation of victims to depiction as aggressors. The evidence avowedly has split opinion to the extent that membership afforded to each might still be a contentious memory. The stories have come to the public domain through books, documentaries, and films in the recent past, influencing perceptions and provoking discussions. After the Second World War and in the first years of the Cold War, Western media depicted foreign Waffen-SS soldiers as anti-Soviet partisans who were in a complex war quandary. This approach softens their image of them being painted as criminals or collaborators and portrays them as soldiers in a war within an ideological war. Representations have been more complex, while engaging in the process of depiction during the earliest stages of historicization. New documentaries and books have explained the horrific involvement of such troops in mass killings and war crimes, particularly against civilians on the Eastern Front. This has made societies have to come to terms with certain truths in their wartime compromises, no matter how much they go against the post-war picture of nationhood. Trauma-Lenhart's attempts to readmit the SS victims and fratricidal foreign soldiers to the combined history of the Second World War disclosed the post-war conflicts within the European cultures. In some of the Eastern European countries where these SS soldiers fought against the Soviets, some far-right and nationalists have, from time to time, attempted to glorify them as fighters against Soviet totalitarianism. This culminated in the erection of memorials or the creation of celebrations labeled as patriotic resistance to communism. These commemorations are very sensitive, particularly to survivors of the Holocaust, historians and activists. They argue that celebrating these people distortion of the activities they carried out under the Nazi regime, and that the goal of any memorialization process is to merely erase the distinction between the victim and the perpetrator. The public memory and the presence of the foreign Waffen-SS seem to be a contentious issue. Woundedness and exposure to trauma also attend that scene of the war in which these veterans and their work are imbricated with national identity in some countries, to a particular way in which recognizing or erasing their contribution raises uncomfortable questions of collaboration and implication. Indeed, the legacy is twice as challenging in France, the Netherlands, and the Baltic states, where the children of both SS officers and memories of genocide manifest themselves in daily life. Reflecting on the ways foreign SS soldiers are commemorated and engaged within the framework of public history is symptomatic of a more general problem of remembrance of the dark past in the present age. That is why, for historians and educators, the issue is still on how to honestly tell these stories responsibly and with historical rigor. Most historians stress context and point out that, without knowing the specific circumstances, it is important to learn what made these men join Waffen-SS, while not justifying what they did. Thus, preserving this interplay of views, historians and filmmakers would like to make people remember the hazards of extremism in worldly affairs and war implications in general, and explain to the public the possibilities of people who face choices and pitfalls of history. They finally endured the foreign Waffen-SS soldiers, the message of the tragedy, and the human aspect of the warfare attitudes and memberships inside and outside the warfare. Discussions on where they belong in history make the need for historical analysis so that the subsequent generations can learn from the events of the Second World War significantly. Since people remain interested in such stories, the issues of memory, ethical condition, and personal identification remain the key to the further discussion of this rather polemic aspect of the historical past, proving that the difficulties of post-war Europe are still left in the modern world. Conclusion. The foreign Waffen-SS soldiers had to go through imprisonment, trial, and exclusion, and in the worst case, they had to be deported. Whereas some remained for years as prisoners of war, living through cold winters and disease in camps, others escaped the first consequences of the war using secret connections and sought asylum in other countries. In their homelands, they were, from the outset, viewed with mistrust, hostility, or sheer outright violence. Despite this, some of the ex-members of Waffen-SS hold veterans' associations to popularize themselves as the just warriors fighting for justice, forming a community that would support their position. These efforts brought heated discussions and promoted historical disputes, which are still actual and can split people. Stories of foreign Waffen-SS veterans are also, to this day, mixed and filled with elements of sorrow, deceit, and reformulation. They continued their actions and interactions as painful reminders of the impossibility of loyalty, sincere ideologies, and honest national identity in times of war. This political implication of continued debate over such veterans prolongs the social dilemmas of post-war history in connection to the global standards of responsibility issues and recalling history. How they should be remembered, or if they should be remembered at all, remains one of the most important questions today defining how we recall World War II.